Welcome back to r/neighbors from hell, where people share stories about their crazy neighbors, and if you are new to my channel, please don't forget to subscribe to join our amazing community, and without any further ado, let's dive right into the stories. The first one is titled, HOA raided my property with tasers and evicted me from my home and destroyed my belongings. This is going to be a little bit crazy, so I would prepare myself if I were you. I lived in an area that was basically 9 or 10 condos that we rented out. The HOA situation was very different than any other one I heard of because the people running the HOA were also the people renting the properties out. That means when I had to go and pay rent every month, instead of it going to a landlord or something, it instead went to the HOA. If anybody else has heard of a system working like this, please let me know, because as far as I can tell, this was an isolated kind of thing. I needed somewhere to live though, and I could afford the condo, so I ran with it. I never had issues either that caused me to need the HOA to do anything for me, so who knows how they would have acted in that situation. One night at probably 4 or 5 in the morning, it was dark, so to me it is night, a bunch of guys broke down my door and started screaming at me. They had uniforms on and were pointing what looked like guns to me, but I found out they were actually tasers later on. I started panicking and telling them that this was my condo and I lived here. They told me to get out of the place right now or I was going to be arrested for trespassing and burglary. I was asleep in my boxers and these guys did not even let me put on a pair of pants or even sandals. When I got outside, I noticed that all of my neighbors were facing the same kind of thing and all of us were very confused. All of us tried to explain to the men that there must have been a mistake and that we lived in those condos. The only information we got from them was that we were considered squatters and if we attempted to re-enter the buildings, we would be tasered and taken down. Keep in mind, some of these people wanted to go back inside to get things like medication. The whole time we are kept outside with these guys pointing tasers at us and there are other guards inside of the condos tearing the places apart for unknown reasons. It took hours before we were all transported to the county jail for holding while the whole thing got figured out. I had never been so scared in my life. After a judge got hold of what happened, we were explained that the bank had foreclosed on the property a month ago and the old owners, the HOA, were told to make sure the land was empty so they could resell. We were all allowed to go and explain to the judge that not a single one of us was aware of this or received any type of letter telling us that we had to move out. In fact, this was about a week into the month, which meant all of us had just paid a rent bill to the HOA. The HOA were the ones that ended up hiring the guards though and claiming that a bunch of squatters were living in the building. Since police can't do anything about squatters, they hired a private company that removed us and then contacted the police to arrest us on totally fake trespassing charges. Either way, the property was foreclosed and all of us had to get our stuff out and leave. When I finally got to get back into my condo, it was about 8 PM and I was burnt out from the long day. I saw that all of my stuff had been thrown around and things like my TV were outright destroyed. They made it look like somebody had been living here and making the entire place a mess even though it was the guards. I also found a few other things destroyed. I took pictures and noted on my phone what had been destroyed before getting everything I could into my car. Things like my couch and desk were probably going to end up lost because there was no way to move all that on no notice. I got my friend to let me crash on his couch for a few days while I figured all this out. One guy that lived in the condos asked if he could have my number because he wanted us all to sue the HOA for what they did to us. I was in and gave him my number and waited for his call. It took a couple of days since we were all trying to get ourselves situated in last-minute places, but then we started the lawsuit against the HOA. We were suing them on so many charges that I probably will forget them all as I try to type them, but I will try nonetheless. First one is for theft because they were taking at least the last rent check and not returning it despite us not being able to live there. Furthermore, trespassing, assault, battery, one guy ended up getting tased, false imprisonment, destruction of property and emotional distress. It might sound like a lot, but seriously, that raid they performed still has me messed up to this day, worried that my door is going to get kicked in for no reason. Even though most of the things that they were being charged for happened because of the company the HOA hired instead of the HOA themselves, they were still considered responsible. They gave the company incorrect information and anything they did was because of the HOA hiring them to do an illegal raid. All of us got some rent back, money to replace damaged or lost property, and for emotional distress. It was not a lot, but I was able to get myself in an apartment where things ran in a way that was more usual with a landlord. My old neighbors also got money dependent on what was lost and how much damage there was. The main thing though is that the fact I got raided illegally and none of them got in worse trouble than having to pay money baffled me. It seems sketchy what they did, and it was probable that they had stolen way more money from us than we actually caught them for. The bank foreclosed because they were not getting any payments for the property. The renters were paying the HOA though, so they must have just been pocketing the money. Instead of sending us letters to just let us know that the building was getting foreclosed and we had to leave, they acted like nothing was wrong and got one last rent check before pulling that. I hate that there are people like that in the world, and I am more worried that they will do something like this again if there were no other repercussions that I knew of. If somebody got really hurt, that would be on them, and I sadly don't think that they would even have cared. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, this story was so outrageous that I actually did some further research because this story was not from Reddit, it was from a different forum and written from the perspective of someone that was involved in this, and it turned out that it is actually a true story. Anyway, if you like the crazy stories about HOAs and awful neighbors, then please don't forget to like the video because that would help me tremendously. Thank you so much. The next one is titled, Neighbor burned down our shared tree property line and claimed he owns my property now. It seems like the older I get, the more rude and snobby people I have to deal with. I'm incredibly grateful to live in the neighborhood that I live in, as my family and I have worked our butts off for a property like this. We lived on the base of a hill and there were 2 houses on our property. Technically, the second one was a guest house, but we converted it into a more real house for my son and daughter and their baby to move into. I loved having my son close to me and I know my wife did too. The area surrounding our property and neighborhood was mountainy terrain, filled with lush bushes and big bulky trees. In our own yard, we have huge maple trees that are a beautiful red color. My neighbor, who is some retired guy that loves to complain about everything, is very loud about the fact that he hates those bright ugly red trees. Now, the property came with the trees and mind you, they were not as big when we first bought the house, but they were already here. My wife loves them and so does my daughter-in-law. They make our garden stand out, and to be honest, I find it hard to believe that anyone could look at a beautiful maple tree and think that it is ugly. Before the big incident took place, that is what this story is about, so stay tuned, the guy complained about our trees all the time. One day during the summer, he came over to complain that we needed to cut back our trees because the shade from our trees was ruining his pool. Now, I myself don't want to sound entitled or anything, or sound like a know-it-all, but I know for a fact that if our trees produce any shade on his property, it will barely touch his pool. And besides, on a hot and sunny summer day, shade in the pool is not a bad thing. Plus, the trees acted as a fence, if you will. There was no actual barrier between our properties, so the trees were the fence. Apparently, a few days after this incident, he complained to my wife that the trees were causing sunlight to cast off his bedroom window. Huh? Wouldn't they just block the sunlight instead? The guy would go on and on, finding every single reason he could to hate the trees. Well, towards the end of the summer, he produced his best excuse, which would eventually put him in jail. He said that he was going to remodel his backyard and found out that his property line was actually farther out than he thought, meaning that our trees were technically on his property. He said he had land surveyors out and everything. Now, I am a self-proclaimed homebody myself and I never saw anyone out. I asked him before we made any decisions and I wanted to call some land surveyors out myself to see what they had to say. I was suspicious for incredibly good reasons, obviously, and did not trust a word he was saying. So I searched around and set up an appointment for some land surveyors to come out. They came out like 2 or 3 days later, and guess what? Shocker, my neighbor was full of it and the property line ended a couple of feet in front of the trees. This meaning the trees and the space around them was on our property. Now this is the good part of the story. I live in a drier climate area and we are prone to wildfires in the summer and fall seasons. Because of this, there are strict laws about what you can do in regards to lighting fires and related things. As a matter of fact, when this took place, there was a smaller wildfire that they were finally getting contained. Anyways, I woke up one morning and it smelled like something was burning. I thought my wife or son was cooking and burned something, knowing that they were not the best cooks. However, as I looked through the house, I could not find anything. However, I could see smoke out of my backyard windows and I went to investigate. When I went outside, my heart sank. The line of maple trees was on fire. I immediately yelled for my wife and family and told them to call 911. It is so crazy how much chaos can happen in just an instance. I turned on the garden hose and sprayed what I could, but the trees were already toasted. Several other neighbors had also called 911 and firefighters arrived shortly. They were able to get the fire out without any major damage to the property or house, besides the trees obviously, and upon further investigation, they found a gas canister sitting in between the trees. When they brought this up to me, I knew it had to be my neighbor. Sure enough, the security cameras on the guest house caught him setting up a rig to light on fire. Not only was he charged with arson and taken to jail, but he, on top of the property damages he had to pay, he also had to pay an additional fine for technically starting a wildfire. This was 2 years ago and he is still in jail. However, his wife still lives in the house and I am being a dick, but with the money we got, we were able to replant some maple trees and eventually they will even grow taller than the previous ones. Good old revenge. The next one is titled Nosy Neighbor Part 1. This is definitely not the worst neighbor from hell story on here, but I am stuck at home and just need to vent. When we moved into our house 2 years ago, everyone told us that the woman living in the house next door, let's call her Ellen, is an absolute nutjob. I really wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt and was nothing but friendly the first time we met. She came over to say hi and we mentioned that this is our first house. I remember her saying that good neighbors keep their distance and not to ask them for advice. However, over the next few months, every time we were in our backyard, she would come over to the fence to talk. For her, having a conversation meant asking incredibly personal questions, giving unsolicited advice, and trash-talking other neighbors. One afternoon, she asked me my religion. I told her that I grew up Christian, but I am agnostic now. A few days later, she told my husband that he had had a cough for the last week because we had let the devil into our house. She spoke derogatively of Russians and Mexicans who helped the previous owner flip our house. She also casually used the N-word while telling a story to my husband. Fast forward a year, we find out I am pregnant. The day Ellen found out, she made a weird comment about how we are having a baby. She asked me tons of personal questions about whether I would be breastfeeding, how long I plan to take off work, her mom should be home for the first 5 years, how much weight I had gained, what I was eating, etc. I answered her questions because I honestly didn't know how to respond, but they kept getting more and more invasive. We had our baby in February of this year, so I am still on maternity leave and my husband is working from home. I'm on baby duty most of the day, but my husband takes him in the evening so I can have some downtime during which I typically work on the yard. Ellen made a point to mention to me every time she saw me outside that I should be taking care of the baby and save my energy for him. I let it slide the first few times, but one afternoon she told me I needed to go take care of him, and I told her it was none of her business and walked into my house. She yelled after me to go take care of my baby, and she blissfully ignored me for the next few weeks. If her husband was in there gardening at the same time as me, she would call him inside, and I actually heard her reprimanding him for saying hi to me. So last night, my husband is outside in the yard and I hear her voice while I am in the kitchen. "Tell OP," but didn't hear the rest. I walked outside and asked her to repeat what she said, which was to ask me not to lean on the fence. I have been eradicating blackberries along our property line and planting an evergreen hedge, but certainly have not leaned on the fence, so I asked her what she was talking about. Completely ignoring me, she says to my husband that there are children 2 houses down and it's not appropriate, and I realized that she thinks a woman that just had a baby pulling out weeds in yoga pants is too sexual. Now I am just dreading spending the summer outside with my new baby and having to deal with her. Maybe I will just yell, "Grow faster," to my plants if she tries to talk to me. The next one is an update to the nosy neighbor's story. I walked into the backyard this evening to finish planting my evergreens. When I started digging, Ellen said, "Digging a lot of holes, huh?" "Yep," I said, and left it at that. She then goes, "Keep digging, you know what I mean." And I said that nope, I have absolutely no idea what she means, and she goes, "Dig another one, 6 feet deep, for yourself," and starts walking to her house. I probably should have just recorded it and let it go, but I yelled after her that she's a horrible person. She comes out and yells, "F you," while flipping me off. Again, I probably should have just let it go, but I flipped her off right back. And then our husbands came outside, mine with our 3-month-old son sleeping in his arms, and her husband is like, "Here is the thing, you planted these giant hedges, 4 feet tall arbor vitae that are only supposed to reach 8 feet, and when they are over 6 feet, I'm going to have to come in here with shears and clip them all." Meanwhile, Ellen is standing behind him flipping me off while I politely informed him off. While she is telling F you to me and calling me a witch, I'm explaining to her husband that number 1, these are dwarf varieties, I would never plant a huge hedge and block their southern light. Number 2, you need to use your words. We will happily move the plants back from the decaying chain link fence if they are worried about it being too close. We are first-time homeowners and don't always know what we are doing. It was so clear that they had just been festering. So the part that gets me is my child just sleeping through this craziness. Ellen is screaming at me saying that I've never liked her. Her husband is talking to my baby of all people about how cute his pajamas are, and my husband is just staring at her husband in total shock that he is not telling his drunk ass wife to F off, which I am totally doing at this point. He then quietly says to my husband that maybe they can talk about this tomorrow. He is terrified of his wife, and I am too now, so I have my husband stand with me out there for 20 minutes while I finish planting. We have already reached out to our contractor to have a 6-foot fence built ASAP. The cherry on top is our other next door neighbor called us after this to check in and told us that the same thing happened to them with her when they first moved in. So clearly she is truly a psycho. The next one is titled, I Got Epic Revenge. I had a great relationship with my dad. When I was young, my father was also my best friend. He was sort of like a role model for me. He worked multiple jobs to support my family, all while powering his way through law school. He even built a couple of small businesses from the ground up with a couple of his friends. All while doing this, he managed to be the best dad ever, spending as much time as he could with my mother, myself, and my baby siblings. One day, we found out that he had stage 4 stomach cancer, the kind that you don't recover from. My mother and I stayed by his side all the way till it was all over. The last memory I have of my father was when he was completely immobile, practically a vegetable at this point, with tubes going in and out of his body, and me just praying that he would still be able to remember who I was. All the guy could do was smile at me just to let me know he still recognized his son, even if the doctors told us most of his memories would be gone. Eventually, he fell into a coma for some days before waking up to say goodbye to my mom, who was by his side when he died. She was a housewife, so we really didn't have much to go on after his death. Enter my grandfather. He was one of those self-centered boomer types who makes everything about himself. After my father died, he would use the newspaper obituary to boast about his dead son's grades and achievements, which I realized seemed to be the only thing my dad was to him. Just in case you were wondering, yes, we are Asian. My mother was grieving and trying to find a way to make ends meet, and my grandfather graciously offered to help her control my father's two businesses to help support us. My mother agreed because she did not have any experience. While we grew up, the two businesses did not provide much for us, likely because my father was one of the big reasons they were thriving. Mom was in and out of multiple jobs just to keep us floating. My grandfather offered to help put me and my siblings through school. I managed to score some scholarships with some good schools growing up, so thankfully he did not have to do as much for me, but we were really glad that he helped out with my siblings. After I made it out of school, I found out that my family was broke and my two siblings were still making their way through medical school. My sister even offered to stop and just get a job, but I told her to keep going because she was doing well and that she deserved to graduate. My grandparents had cut us off because they didn't approve of the directions my siblings took in life, especially my sister, who was for them too female to have a career in medicine. My grandma is a bit of a misogynist. And by the way, Ripe Stars, I don't really understand how someone, even if you are a stupid misogynist, can believe that someone can be too female to work in medicine. I mean, there have been female doctors for what, like thousands of years? Anyway, she said, "Why are you wasting your time and money becoming a doctor? You're just going to have children and quit." I was working as a high school teacher when I was contacted by one of my dad's old business partners for one of his companies. After I asked him about how the company was doing, he told me that my grandpa, who was still in control of my father's shares, was siphoning money from the company for himself, and he was earning way more than he was giving me and my siblings for our education. So, all our lives he had been making us feel indebted to him for money that was supposed to be ours to begin with, and he lied to us by telling us that Dad's companies were not making any money for us at all. We also realized that when he cut us off, he was cutting us off from our own money, forcing my siblings to drop out and give up careers that they'd been working their whole lives for. What's worse is that this was our father's money, and we know that he would have wanted it to help us provide for our futures even after he died, and here comes his a-hole father basically crapping on his legacy for his own enrichment. I even found out that he used his position to take possession of the company's office space and forced them to set up shop in a smaller, cheaper office, while renting the original space out under his own name to the company's competitors to make money from them too, all while I had to work multiple jobs to help my mother and siblings pay the bills. Cue the revenge. My grandfather's biggest weakness has always been his pride. In fact, I suspect that he wanted us to think he was helping support us out of his own pocket because he wanted everyone to think that he was some kind of hero, when in reality he was financially choking us. I realized that no matter what my grandfather said, my siblings, my mother and I were legally the owners of my father's company shares. So after having a statement signed by the three of them, I approached all the board of directors sans my grandfather and let them know that I was now that sole representative of my late dad's estate. My grandfather also made himself chairman of the board. According to the company records, he did no work for the company at all, so the position was just a name that allowed him to receive money. So I convinced them that since he was only chairman, as representative of my father's estate, that made me the chairman. I did not intend to keep the position because I did not have any experience for it. Then I contacted other members of my extended family about my grandpa's unethical practices with the company's office space. He was eventually pressured by them into evicting the company's main competitor from their office space. Serves them right for conniving with my grandpa to take the company's old office space. At the next board meeting, I prepared for the moment I'd been waiting my entire life for. When he entered the conference room to preside over the meeting as the chairman, he found his chair facing away from the table with all the board members already seated at the table, and like a Bond villain, I spun the chair around to reveal to him that I'd been the one sitting there the entire meeting. I told him that the company and my family no longer needed him and that I'd be taking control over my representation of my father's estate. "Do you know that I'm the one who put him and his siblings through school?" he said in shock. I only went, "No, my dad did." The look of sheer embarrassment on his face was perfect. I've never seen him look so defeated my entire life until that moment, and this sort of satisfaction could not be achieved by simply ratting him out. I stepped down from the chairman position and took a job in the company's treasury department as a bookkeeper with a meager salary, but at least now any profit sharing or dividends that the company released would go where my father wanted it to go. And finally, one of the first decisions I got to make as a board member before stepping down was to give my mother a permanent job that she deserved. My grandpa is now jobless. He spends all his time at home, and because he spent his life being selfish and self-centered, he has no friends. All he had going for him was being able to power trip over other people and boasting about his assets and achievements. Even my grandma has had it with him, and the two don't even sleep in the same room anymore. I hope he lives the rest of his short life regretting that he did not live his life with more compassion and humility. And yeah, ripe stars, I gotta say, that was really an epic revenge story, and it could almost be a movie plot. Thank you to OP for posting this fantastic revenge story. I could not have done it any better if I was in OP's shoes, honestly. Let me know in the comments what is your favorite revenge story of all time that you have heard on my channel. I am curious to hear what you think.